Hey everybody! So we're finally getting around to doing my labor and delivery story. I am coming towards the end of my 3rd week postpartum. Ronen will be 4 weeks old this coming Tuesday, and it is Saturday today. And yeah, I guess Phil and I will talk about it from both of our respective points of view, as I'm sure, what he experienced was very different from what I was perceiving since I was in labor land. But anyway, things ended up going quite a bit differently than planned, as can be expected with having babies. Expect the unexpected. We'd initially planned a home birth, and it did not end up working out for a variety of reasons that popped up. Basically, I started going into labor when we were making my 40-week video when I was 1 day overdue. I started having contractions around 1 in the afternoon. They started out about 15 minutes apart, and then things progressed very, very quickly, like twice as quickly as what is average for a first-time mother like myself. And by, 3 or 4 in the afternoon, my contractions were about 3 minutes apart. Excuse me. And luckily Phil's mother was around, and she was a midwife, so she at that point basically put me in the bathtub in some hot water, which made my contractions stronger, but was also soothing. We called my midwife, and she came over, and she examined me, and I was already 5 centimeters dilated. So that would explain why I was, in a lot more pain than what I had expected, and the reason for that was that my contractions were really, really strong, and as a result, really, really productive. I mean, Phil's mom said that when she had her hand on my back during the contraction, she could feel my entire back seize up, and usually you can only feel it around the front if you're somebody else. So the problem at this point is that my midwife told me that I had an anterior lip, which is what happens when your cervix doesn't dilate evenly. Part of it will be thinning out, and part of it won't be thinning out so well. And that was happening because Ronen's head was deflected, which means it wasn't coming down like this, but his head was up. So it was putting uneven pressure on my cervix, which was making me dilate unevenly and making my already extremely strong contractions even more painful. So because of this, I decided to go to the hospital. And things are kind of a blur from this point, if you want to take it from here.
Well, I shall take the mantle then and explain the rest of our time in labour and then delivery. The labour, as Alison mentioned, it progressed very rapidly. Our contractions were 3 months apart, they were almost constant, and we had to take a cab there, and throughout the entire cab journey there would be a moment where she'd say, having another one, grip the car seat, grip her mum.
And it was only about a 10-minute ride to the hospital, and then I was examined when I got there, and I was 8 centimeters.
8 centimeters dilated.
Yeah, within like 5 hours of being in labor.
Now, Alison had requested to go to the hospital because she wanted the epidural. Now, I would say that when she first mentioned it, my mum and perhaps others of us were a little sceptical. Thought, maybe it's just the exposure to the contractions. Maybe she'll start to level out and she'll be able to endure it as time goes on, but they actually seem to be getting more severe, more intense, and thus harder to deal with. So although they were productive, they were impossible to deal with on her own.
Yeah.
We'd also mentioned to her while she was in the bath the idea of having gas and air because the midwife would bring it to the house, but she said that that would not cut the cheese.
I did try it at the hospital though,
yes.
And all it did was give me dry mouth, make my voice lower
and lightheaded,
and
the pain.
Yeah, the way I deal with pain is I really need to be able to focus on it, and it was making it hard for me to focus on the contractions, and I was becoming more anxious. And I'm really not an advocate for epidurals, but because things had progressed so quickly for me, I was absolutely exhausted. And I was starting to panic, and at that point, when you're in labor, if you start to panic and you get tired, you kind of move from being in pain to the realm of suffering, and I didn't want to lose control. So I was so dilated, only a couple centimeters away from being fully dilated, but at this point I didn't think I was going to have it in me to push, so we called in the anesthetist, the anesthesiologist, and yeah, it ended up being a bit of a nightmare getting the epidural.
She was having to sit on the bed to have the epidural inserted, but there seemed to be an issue in trying to insert the needle, which is quite long and thick, and it's trying to enter a very small area, as you may know if you've had an epidural done or if you know about the procedure, and it took in total about 45 minutes to get the epidural done.
My contractions were coming about 30 seconds apart at this point.
And in this whole time, the anaesthetist was having to ask Alison to sit still and don't move, and then there'd be some item that she hadn't got on her tray, so we had to send someone out to get that item. So procurement led to the delay in having the epidural inserted. I think they tried more than once as well to get it inserted.
3 times.
3 times, so
I sat stock still for 45 minutes with my contractions coming less than a minute apart.
Bent forward over my bump like this, so she could, see all of my vertebrae. And yeah, I thought I was going to die. But Alison enjoyed it, and eventually it was inserted, and it worked very well.
Yeah.
In fact, very shortly after she had the epidural inserted, she then had her waters break. At around 7 or 8 centimetres dilated, so things were progressing quite well. And then at that point, we had a plateau. We were waiting for further progress for another. The epidural had been set about 8:45, but little Ronen here was born around 10 hours later, so there was a long period in which not very much was happening. In that time, we had to monitor Alison and make sure that her temperature was fine, and unfortunately during that time she developed a fever, and as did the Ronen here, so they had to get her some antibiotics and some saline to make sure that she had some fluids running through. And with the epidural it wasn't a complete success because it wasn't quite equivalent, it wasn't balanced between right and left sides, but that was helpful.
A good thing because I still had some sensation, so I was still having some pain when I'd have a contraction, but it was pain that I could manage with my level of exhaustion. The fact that I developed an infection and had a fever, it was a really good thing that I got the epidural because my strength went down from there. And the reason things plateaued and that I stopped dilating at 8 centimeters was partially because of the epidural that often slows down labor, but it was also because of his deflected head, and he also had something on his head called caput, which is a bit of swelling that was making it hard for him to come down. So I think around 4 in the morning they ended up giving me syntocinon, which is artificial oxytocin, which I'm really not a fan of unless it's absolutely necessary to use because it's an induction medication. But they gave it to me to make my contractions even stronger to see if the anterior lip would resolve, and it did. It ended up resolving shortly after, and I stopped topping up my epidural, so I started getting sensation back, and it had completely dissipated by the time it was time for me to start pushing, and I felt the urge to push, and I got him down most of the way. He was crowning, and at that point I completely lost all strength and I nearly collapsed, so they had a couple of obstetricians come in to help the midwife assist my delivery, and they just guided him out the rest of the way after he crowned.
It was a ventouse delivery.
Yeah, ventouse. But it was different from normal ventouse deliveries because he was crowning. They just pulled him out after a second. So, yeah, he was born at 7:20 in the morning. I was in labor for 18 hours. It's like I got, 80% of the way, and then things got really complicated. So it was a good thing we went into the hospital. The only thing I'm really kind of unhappy with the experience is that he was taken away from me almost immediately. I delivered him and I put him on my chest, and I think I held him for about 10 seconds. And then I don't even know, why did they take him away?
They took him away, I think, because of the infection during the labour. So they had to make sure that he was in a fit state of health. Also, he was getting quite tired towards the end of the labour and the delivery. So they had to run some checks on him.
His heart rate was dropping.
His heart rate was dropping. That's why they also used the ventouse method towards the end. So they had to run some checks on him, and they put him under the special light, which is very warm. They checked.
The French fry warmer.
French fry warmer. Lovely. So they ran the checks against him, and I've seen his notes, and they all checked out. His skin colour was good, reflexes, response, alertness. His general state of health at the time was very good, so they were pleased about that. But it did mean that Alison didn't have that skin to skin that she'd been hankering for and that she'd been wanting from the very beginning. So that was a disappointment about the process. I got to hold him a lot more than Alison did in those first few hours, a lot more.
Yeah, I didn't really get to hold him until hours after, because I had another complication. About an hour after I delivered, I was kind of dozing, just waiting for Ronen to be brought to me finally so I could try to nurse. And in the middle of my dozing, I started to have some trouble breathing. And very shortly after, I was completely gasping for air. I could not catch my breath. Doctors rushed in with nurses and some midwives, and they were trying to figure out what was actually going on with me. They thought I was having respiratory arrest. Apparently, a rare postpartum occurrence is, maternal lung collapse or respiratory arrest, and I thought that was happening to me. And if it was, I probably would have died.
He's fine.
But, thankfully that was not happening. And eventually they figured out that for some reason my body was not releasing any fluid. And during my labor, I had been given a lot of fluid. I had 2 bags of saline and 1 bag of Hartmann's. And none of it was getting released. So because my body was overloaded with fluid, I was having trouble breathing. So they gave me an intravenous diuretic, and my body released the fluid, and then I was fine. Yeah.
Alison had a lot of things attached to her during the whole labour.
Yeah.
At that stage, she had a catheter inserted as well.
From the epidural.
And she had, of course, the ventouse and the saline coming in through the hands. That was also, that sometimes a bit of a bother because it was quite sore, and I think the
midwife who put in my cannula for the IV did not do a good job.
Unfortunately, I remember as Ronen was taken away to her under the French fry warmer. Now everyone has possibly a romanticised view of how those first few moments will be once the baby is delivered. Maybe from those One Born Every Minute shows when they have the music kick in and it's just all lovely. But the first thing that Alison's saying is, "My cannula came out."
Because when they handed him to me, they knocked it and it started coming out of my hand, and I was bleeding. And
so it was a bit of a bum note, which unfortunately chided with the birth of our beautiful little one here. But the first thing I said was, when I saw him and they placed him under the French fry warmer, was, "He looks like your dad."
Yeah, and he does. He looks like my dad.
He does look like her father.
He's big. He weighed 8 pounds when he was born, 8 pounds exactly, and he was 52 centimeters long, and his head was, 30-something centimeters?
Yeah, around 30-something centimeters.
Around 30-something. So he's a big boy.
Mm-hmm. I should mention that in the time that they were trying to figure out what was wrong with Alison's breathing, I had to take him to the neonatal unit. As Alison had developed the fever during the labour, they needed to make sure that he got some antibiotics, and of course they couldn't get those orally, it would have to be intravenously. So I had to take our little one here, no more than a couple of hours old, blearing in the light, having to require an insertion of a cannula in order to have the antibiotics submitted. So I held him for a good couple of hours, a good few minutes, while I waited for the doctors to come and prepare him. And because he was 8 pounds, they were quite unused to the amount of skin, the amount of fat there that was already accrued on him. Normally in the neonatal unit, when they put a cannula in, the baby's premature,
small,
so there's very little body fat, so they can insert it quite easily. But this guy, they're having to squeeze the hand and insert it, but they couldn't get it in either hand. One of his hands was very bruised for a long time
It still
after
has a
it.
little bruise on it.
Could be there for a while. And eventually, after trying both hands and one foot, they got it into the other foot. So that was a bit of an ordeal for him, and there I was, holding this little guy who was no more than an hour old, having something inserted into him. And he was crying, of course, but that was part of the course, and it was probably the best thing to do, as it ensured that if he did have an infection at the time, that it would be remedied. And when we were discharged from the hospital a few days later, they gave him a clean bill of health, no evidence in the blood culture test that they had done at the time of inserting the cannula that there was anything amiss or anything wrong.
Yeah, they kept us in the hospital for a long time because of the infection, and I was so exhausted. See, I went into labor on Monday, and I didn't end up getting to sleep until Thursday. That's 4 days without sleep, and I was starting to hallucinate. I was going a little nutty. And the reason I didn't really get any sleep was obviously in the hospital. There's staff coming in and out of the room all the time. But also, this guy was cluster feeding on me like crazy. He would feed on me for about 45 minutes and then sleep for about 20 minutes or 30 minutes and then want to eat again. And one of the midwives in the hospital said it was one of the worst cases of cluster feeding she'd ever seen. And it was really difficult on me because obviously we were both just starting to learn how to nurse, so I was getting sore from that, and I also have flat nipples, which makes it impossible for him to latch on the first couple of times because he has to draw the nipple out. So by the time we left the hospital, I was so badly damaged that I couldn't put him to the breast for a week, and I was pumping, and we had to start giving him formula so he would gain weight, and he was jaundiced, and feeding is what resolves that. But I've been doing a combination of breast and bottle feeding since then, but again, because of my flat nipples, I'm really severely damaged, especially my right breast. The left one seems to be easier for him. And he's a champ. He has a really good nursing reflex. He gapes really, really wide, and he, if I didn't have flat nipples, I'm sure it'd be perfect now. So, unfortunately, we're having to resolve to nipple shields. Once I heal a bit more, we're going to try that. But, yeah, I need to get an electric pump. I also had a breast reduction when I was 18, so that's another obstacle. But yeah, he was taken away from me right away. I have flat nipples, and I had a breast reduction. So those are a lot of tough things to deal with. But I have been nursing him for almost a month now, and that's longer than some women with perfect breasts end up breastfeeding. So he's snoring. I don't know if you can hear him. I don't know.
That's the labour and delivery story in short.
Yeah.
Much shorter than 18 hours, but I think it gives you an idea of how both how fast it seemed to go and then how complicated it got towards the end.
Things can change very, very quickly.
Ultimately, it was the right decision, I believe, to have gone to the hospital because of the anterior lip. It would have made a home birth a lot more difficult.
And the infection.
The infection as well. Although we didn't want to be in the hospital for that period of time, and we had to wait a while until the results came back, it was at least 48 hours until the blood cultures would process. We were in the right place at the time when Alison developed that infection and when she had the anterior lip. So it was the better decision.
Yeah, you have to remain flexible, and I had my goals, but initially my number one goal was to stay at home for as long as possible. And that's exactly what I did. I was pretty much all the way there once we got to the hospital.
Absolutely. The bath helped. It both made the contractions more intense and stronger, but also gave a more soothing manner to Milady here. it was quite the experience. Lots of frenetic phone calls to friends and family, to the midwife, to a cab service, and all manner in between. We had to keep people updated regularly, especially her father, who was not in the country at the time, and also my mum, being present, a midwife by trade and by training, having to stand back to some degree to not interfere with the practice of the midwives at the time, because that might be seen to be a little meddling. Even so, she still somehow de facto became very involved in Alison's delivery anyway, so it helped, and her mum was there as well, so I believe Alison had the support that she needed and wanted, and now our little one is right here and is doing very well, very healthy, and as I mentioned before, that's labour and delivery.
And today's our second wedding anniversary today.
Happy anniversary, Nalini. This
Okay.
is what results.
Okay, everyone, so yeah, there he is. He's sleeping. He's pooped.
And I think he's pooped. I smell something poopy. This guy.
On that note, we're gonna go. So I'll talk to you guys on Tuesday or Wednesday for my 4-week postpartum update.
Bye bye.